Greetings ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to today's Reddit series video from the subreddit HFY called Chrysalis Chapter 15, written by Beaver Fur. The sky level of Nayam Prime's archaeologies was a city over a city, a second urban layer suspended above the wispy clouds, a collection of expanse terraces, lush gardens and broad walkways, all of them wrapped up in a shimmering purple breaker fields, and delicate and strong cold winds played across such heights, particularly at night. Darkat was on one of those terraces now. An artificial esplanade bathed him in bright blue and yellow lights as 100 automated vid cameras were fluttering all over the crowd, a small spherical bodies zipping here and there, pausing for a few seconds when they detected something interesting enough to record. A conversation maybe, an interview to one of the two delegations, or just a brief scene to broadcast to the live audience of billions of sentients being that they were watching the event, all across the many worlds of the galaxy's Federation Council and the Associated States. After all, it wasn't every day that a new accords was signed. He was taking a respite a few steps away from the thick crowd, away from the relentless socialization, mingling and political games going on all over the place. Instead, Darkat turned his gaze towards the breathtaking sights surrounding the terrace that he leaned over the railing, safe in the knowledge that the break of fields would prevent any accident. He was looking at the endless sky sprawl of the arcologies, the sea of artificial light spreading underneath like a reflection of the night sky. It was strange. He had guessed that he would feel a sense of vertigo, but the sky level was so high above the main ground that there was no disconnection. Much like when traveling in an aerial vehicle, it didn't feel like he was being someplace high so much as someplace disconnected from the ground, as if Darkat's mind was unable to intuitively grasp the actual height, refusing to acknowledge the true scale of the arcologies. The vid cameras hovered nearby, turning to snap a few three-dimensional pictures of him before flying back down towards the crowd. Darkat sighed. He knew that he would get back into the thick of things soon, even if his work with negotiations for the new accords was already over. There was always a new treaty to work on, always someone to talk to, someone to greet or be introduced to. But it just felt good to take a respite after the nightmarish, difficult negotiations of the past weeks. He had been working non-stop ever since attending the dinner of the Imperium Palace with Naxtani in what now felt like a lifetime ago. So yes, he had definitely earned a respite, and upon arriving to his core world 2 days ago, he had decided to take his time at Nayam Prime, some well-deserved vacations, spending most of his time wandering around the sky level, not unlike the other tourists, and trying not to think too hard about the mountains of work he knew awaited him as soon as he returned to his new post. Darkat hoped that whatever new diplomatic crisis was already gesturing between the Terrans and the Zinba Republic and its internal tribes would be considerate enough to wait a few more days before demanding his full attention. He couldn't complain, though. He knew many of the other diplomats in the Espelanda eyed him with envious looks. Darkat had been put in charge of the Council's special mission to the Urian Arm, a task force responsible for the diplomatic relations of both Terrans and Zinvarians. The main goal was to prevent future conflicts and build the bridges between the two species, which wasn't easy given the history of mass murder and genocide. Despite the colossal amount of work, he knew that he was in a good position. Being the leader of such a delegation in a galaxy's top hotspot meant Darkat had been one step below the Zekharine himself in the pecking order. And it meant he got invited to things like these. He thought as he got a glimpse of Dessen Lawyer in the crowd, a celebrity philosopher being followed by a cohort of admirers. Meet, really? Darkat turned to look at his approaching assistant, Fassian, who was an odd piece, almost an opposite picture of Darkat himself. Where Darkat was slender, Fassian was short and stocky, his skin scaly rather than smooth. Even his species was known to be straightforwardness rather than any sort of diplomatic politeness. So of course, Darkat had jumped at the chance to recruit him from the task force. He looked at the plate of food in Fassian's hand, and it was some sort of Terran recipe, or a reproduction of one at any rate. Thick slices of meat covered by a brown sauce, and the green and white vegetables thrown on for good measure. It's synthetic, you know, Darkat said. No animals harmed. That doesn't make it any less gross, he mumbled. And why do we have Terran recipes anyway? They don't even eat food. You know, Fusian, nobody is going to tell you their secrets. If I don't eat their food first, I know. Fusian grumbled. Who told you that, by the way? You're always repeating it. Darkhat smiled. Someday I'll teach you. But it's true. Turns out that food diplomacy is more important than it seems at first. So make sure that you eat some Sinvarian recipes too once you're done with that, or with the plate. We don't want them to send the wrong message. And I don't want to vomit, Fusian said. Then he let out an exaggerated sigh. All right, whatever you say, you're the boss. A sudden agitation in the crowd attracted Darkhat's eyes. It was hard to tell from when he stood, but it looked like the Zacharine was giving out some sort of public statement. Darkhat caught a glimpse of the Grand Minister's chitinous head, most of the vid cameras orbiting around the broadcasting his words. Fusian followed his gaze. We'd all do the work, he gets all the glory. Darkhat nodded. Politics, that's the way it is. Doesn't it bother you? Darkhat mulled that over for a few seconds. Did it bother him? His conversation with the Terran during the attack on Zimba had received quite a few compliments once it went public, but much of the galactic population's attention had gone towards the aftermath of the attack itself. The smoking craters where avenues and residence apartments complexes had once stood, the flooded cities and the underground refuges filled with drowned corpses. They had made for much more impressive pictures, and while people intellectually knew that if not for him it would have been much worse, that didn't stop them from focusing on just how bad it had actually been. Then negotiations with the more reasonable new Terrans had started. Darkhat had been pivotal there, of course, acting as an intermediary between the two species and coordinating the team of diplomats that eventually became the task force he now headed. But the Zacharine had been the spokesperson towards the rest of the Galactic Council, so while Darkhat's work had been acknowledged by the High Governance and privately rewarded, in the eyes of the public it was the Grand Minister who got all the accolades for ending the war. He knew he wouldn't have been happy in the past, but back his time with Naxtani, back when he had wanted to land a delicate position in the same core world, but public recognition somehow didn't seem that important now. No, he replied at last, not really. We each have our different roles to play. I'd rather be out there making things happen than in here giving speeches, and it also means that the Zacharine is in our debt. A Grand Minister can grant some powerful favors, you know. So having a grateful one on our side is better long-term than a few minutes in the limelight. I don't know, Fusian said. Seems like having my ugly mug in the vidcasts would impress that Zactarian I met yesterday. Darkhat blinked. I thought you already had a partner of your own species, Fusian. He took a bite of his plate. Didn't say that I was going to marry her, too, did I? Darkhat smirked. Fusian's colorful personality had caught him by surprise at first, that his jokes were delivered at the same matter-of-fact vocal tone as he always used, with no tell or facial signs whatsoever that he'd been confusing. But now Darkhat knew enough to recognize when Fusian was being serious. Or so he thought. Heads up, muttered the assistant. We've got a gearbox incoming. Darkhat followed his gaze to see the member of the Terran delegation was walking towards them. He frowned slightly. These new Terran bodies looked organic enough that they could easily forget that there were machines underneath. There was no telling as to how long the range of artificial ears was, so he should remind Fusian to watch his words when there were Terrans nearby. Darkhat couldn't help but feel a slight discomfort at the sight of the approaching machine. He knew it wasn't rational, but he couldn't erase the images of the mechanical soldiers advancing along the ruined buildings of Yovit, the same leisurely pace, the same arm swing and the positioning of their feet. Except, of course, that the one approaching him now wasn't the automated drone in a massive army, but a sentient creature of its own right. And while the overall body shape was the same, looking at it closer, it was clear that the appearance was vastly different from the assault soldiers. This machine had been designed for social interactions rather than combat. Its lines were smooth, and it had an actual face delicately molded after the original organic species they had evolved from. All in all, the Terran could easily pass as an organic creature, if not for the polished alabaster white outer surface, or skin, if you want to call it that. Now, cat, the Terran said, offering a right hand, the corners of his mouth gently moving upwards. I'm glad you are here. Always happy to see a familiar face. Darkhat nodded and took the machine's hand in his own, shaking it as per the Terran's greeting ritual. The surface was cold to the touch, he noticed. Likewise. Darkhat turned to Fusian. And this is my assistant. "Fashion, right?" the Terran said. "I've heard of you, of course. It's nice to finally meet you in the flesh, too, or, in the carbon fiber and polyester urethane polymers, in my case. I'm Thomas, just that, I was lucky enough to be in the first generation, so I don't need to worry about any last names." Fusian greeted the machine, shaking his hand like Darkat had done. The Terran glanced towards the food plate and the assistant's left hand. "Roast duck, right? Do you like it?" Fusian shot a quick glance at Darkat before replying in enthusiasm and a broad smile. I can tell you I've never tasted anything quite like it." Thomas nodded and Darkat let out a soft breath. Fusian could be a wild card at times, but apparently had enough common sense to control these impulses when he needed to, after all. "And isn't that strange," Thomas said, saying, "that you guys can taste the food even before we do? We've had some developments in making artificial taste sensors, but fine-tuning them is more complicated than it might first seem." Darkat nodded and listened with an absent mind as Fusian and Thomas went over the merits of the Terran cuisine. All things considered, he was lucky both the Terrans and the Zimberians had agreed to sign these accords, recognizing each other's right to exist, establishing a formal borders and agreeing to a ceasefire. But it was clear that this was the first step, and the conflict was still far from over. Now, Darkat's team would need to set out in untangling the mess of crossed accusations and demands for reparations. On one hand, the Terrans might have stopped their aggressions, but they had also refused to cede any of their conquered systems or to de-escalate the gargantuan military forces, pushing instead for harsher official sanctions on the Zunba Republic in response to Earth's destruction. And Darkat was well aware that, even though most of the new Terrans supported peaceful resolution, there was also a small but loud faction amongst them that would rather resume a war of extermination and started by the progenitor. On the other hand, the Zunba Republic demanded reparations for their attacks on their colonies and the grievous damage done to their capital world, the fragments from the massive starship that caused millions of casualties from when the impact on the planet, and a deep environmental damage that was hard to quantify. All things considered, though, it looked as though the capital would still recover faster than Anakak-Sparvan. Even if the direct loss of life had been greater, both communication and transport systems had survived, unlike the case of the industrial world. That these new Terrans such as Thomas hadn't had any winning role in those attacks didn't seem to faze the Zimberians, though. Hate and distrust would always be to a new species was on the rise in Zunba Republic population, and many victims of the attack reclaimed some sort of retribution. It was a never-ending cycle, Darkat thought, the pain proverb all over again. He knew it wouldn't take long for a new crisis to ignite, so it was essential that new treaties and agreements were firmly in place before that could happen, tying both species' interests in together and those of the Council, so that rekindling the military conflict would be seen as the wrong move by all parties. With his betting for some sort of compromise, having both parties meet midway, the first step would be convincing the Zunba Republic to agree to a complete or partial demilitarization as a sanction for their past actions. It shouldn't be too hard. Given that the fleet had already been decimated, they wouldn't be in a position to remilitarize for at least a few years. They were already trusting the Council's fleets to protect them, so it would amount to that new reality written down as part of the new treaty. Applying a similar sanction to the Terrans was out of the question, of course. Given their past, their new species would never agree to any sort of reduction of their defensive force. But Darkat thought that having them show some goodwill towards the Zimberians might suffice. Maybe they could use their drones to clean up the fields of debris around Anakak-Sparvan, clearing a way for the freighters to deliver food to the planet desperately needing it. It wasn't easy, but Darkat knew he still had some time before his work would be put to the test. Thankfully, both species seemed more focused on reconstruction of their own respective societies than outward aggression, at least for the time being. The Zimberians in particular were simply unable to engage in any military conflicts and expansionist behavior. It was something Darkat was grateful for, because otherwise he knew the tribes loyal to the Zunba Republic's government would have already engaged in a civil war as a response to Anakak's tribe's defection. But lacking the means to fight, and the most of the population too tired of war and destruction, they were forced to talk to one another and find a diplomatic solution to the internal fracture. All things considered, the truth was Darkat liked dealing with the Terrans better. Unlike the Zinverians and their fertilism, the Terrans were, not naive, but optimistic, their outlook firmly placed in the future rather than in the past, even though they could also be stubborn and unyielding at times. But at any rate, They seemed to be willing to work with the council in ensuring the negotiations were fair, even when trying to push for their own agenda. It was all that Dalcat could ask for, after all. Thomas leaned over the railing, gazing at the city of the archaeologies. "I must say, this is quite an impressive place," he commented. "See anything you'd want to replicate for Tau Ceti?" asked Dalcat, smiling. A few weeks ago he had a chance to pay a visit to the orbital habitat that the Terrans had turned into the de facto capital city. He hadn't been sure what to expect exactly. Maybe a large starship like maze of rooms and corridors. But no, the habitat felt like a city. A city still under construction perhaps, but a city nonetheless. A roofed, dense grid of streets and avenues, complete with unfinished parks, open areas for congested traffic, thousands of automated drones and transports crawling and flying all over the place. And just was only a habitable part of the enormous structure. He knew most of it was devoted to industry and resource processing. It was hard for his mind to grasp the true extents of the factories, hangars, warehouses, and assembly lines extending in all three cardinal directions. Thomas snorted. Like they'd listen to me. No, I'm afraid Tau Ceti's Obermax has fallen prey to the hands of the all-powerful engineering consortium, the lost battle of mere mundanes like me, if ever there was one. Last I heard they were proposing 2-century-long plan to turn it into some kind of megastructure spanning the entire asteroid belt around the star. Never mind that we hardly need that much space. A ring world, I think it's called. Dalcat nodded, feeling amused at Phasian facial expression, his eyes wide open. It was a common reaction to people who were exposed for the first time to the Terrans' particular conception of engineering. If there was something to take away from their bold plans, it was just like the Zuniver public had been on the decline for a long time. The Terrans were clearly the species on the rise. AI governance seemed to agree with the sentiment. An internal report placed on probability of the Terrans becoming an undisputed regional superpower of the Orion Arm at more than 70% within the next 10 years. 95% when looking at the next 20 years. Those were high enough chances that the Council simply could not afford not to do their best and approach the nascent species and attempt to build friendly relationships with them, especially in the light that all had transpired. It wasn't easy, though. There were many roadblocks Dalcat had to navigate around, ranging from Terran's own nature as artificial sentient minds, something that technically was forbidden by the Council's own laws, to the distrust the new species had for their neighbors, the consequences of the first Terran's past actions, which reminded him of the massive starship and how the war had ended. Thomas, Dalcat said, turning to face the machine, there is something I wanted to ask you, related to the Battle of Zinva. The Terran gave him a quick nod, inviting him to keep talking. So, I've been going over the first Terran's actions right at the end, Dalcat continued, and there's something that doesn't quite fit, something that struck me out when I'm reading the battle reports. Oh? Thomas said, his smile still pleasant, though Dalcat's augmented irises noticed the slight, almost imperceptible deepening of his frown. Yes, it was something that went unnoticed at first, but that was revealed when the Council cross-referenced the recordings of the battle by the surviving communication satellites in orbit around Zuniver. Apparently, there was a short, intense burst of extra EM activity coming from the ship just a few seconds before it self-destructed. Our analysis of the thing was there was some sort of transmission, though nobody I asked was sure exactly what it was, other than a profile matches a pattern of, Dalcat, Thomas interrupted in a calm, contemplative tone. Now, I wasn't at the battle myself, so I didn't receive that transmission, whatever it was, but you have to remember that our progenitor was a very troubled, confused mind, and right at the end it was under an enormous amount of stress and self-doubt, all the while piloting a heavily damaged ship. The most likely explanation for the EM burst you're talking about is a simple malfunction, an incoherent activation of the ship's damaged communication array, or maybe just a glitch in the processing units contained in its mind. Ah, I see, but if you, of course, the Terran said, I'll make sure to request our own reports and send them back to you for analysis, so that you can have the information on the matter. But rest assured, I can guarantee you that our progenitor died when the ship crashed into the planet, right after liberating our minds. For better or worse, it's definitely gone. Dalcat nodded. Well, thanks for the clarification, Thomas. The Terran did a waving motion with his hand. Of course, don't worry about it. Then he looked towards the center of the Esplanade. So, aren't you two going to go back into the crowd? Maybe later, Dalcat said. We're taking a rest, enjoying the views, you know. Sure. Well, I'll see you later then, or tomorrow, or at the departure ceremony." Dalcat nodded. "Sounds good. Goodbye, Thomas." The machine waved and walked back to the crowd, right towards the rest of the Terran delegation. Dalcat saw Thomas approaching another of his species delegates, a female Terran whose name he didn't know. Her head fiber strands fell all over her shoulder and down to the middle of her back, with a rhythmic blue light pulsing and traversing them. It was her hypnotizing sight. It was also a good sign, Dalcat thought. It meant the machines were embracing their individuality, customizing their bodies to better reflect their different personalities. Paradoxically, the flashy displays of color and the strange skin patterns was something that brought them closer to the rest of the galaxy's organic species. It moved them away from the plain uniform of the assault drones. He said the assistant. Dalcat turned towards him. "Your thoughts, Phasian?" "I don't know. Thomas seemed to be very eager to remind us that the first Terran is dead." Dalcat nodded. "You noticed that too?" "Sure. You think that they're lying?" He saw the Terran female steal a quick glance at them before resuming their conversation with Thomas. "No," Dalcat said, his mouth twisting into a cunning smile. "I don't think they're lying. I know they are." End of chapter. Chrysalis, Chapter 16, written by Beaverfur. I opened my eyes to a living room. It was dark. The TV screen was the only source of light, bathing the room in a succession of pallid colors and images changed. The soft noise of people talking that came out of the speakers washing over me. I gazed at the screen for a few long seconds, trying to recognize the show, but I couldn't. At any rate, I knew that I wasn't the same thing that I was watching when I closed my eyes. I hadn't fallen asleep. Not really. I couldn't. My electronic brain was incapable of it. No. This had been the closest thing to that, simply not paying attention. Closing my eyes and ignoring the external world of my mental focus moved inwards. A meditation of sorts, I suppose. It would be easy enough to learn the name of the show and everything there was to know about it, of course. I had only to link my mind to the custodian datanet and access the information directly. Easy. Just a thought away. But I didn't. There was a certain delight in not knowing, in keeping myself a mystery alive. Last time I had tried to recreate this experience, I had pretended that I didn't know what show it was even then, though its knowledge had always been right there in my mind. Not this time. Now, it was real. Without the databanks being part of my consciousness anymore, I didn't know. That I was confined to a single body also made it more authentic. Last time, I had been big, my awareness almost omniscient and spread across hundreds of thousands of sensors in as many machines, but now there was only a single body with a single point of reference. That too could be fixed by requesting access to some of Custodian's resources and sensors. I wouldn't need much, simply just linking my mind to a passive sensor would suffice to expand my awareness back into being big again. Except that I didn't want to. I guess that I should have felt more confined, trapped within the limits of the small single body. But I actually welcomed it. There was something liberating in not knowing what went down beyond these walls. I was actually enjoying the absence of responsibility, even if that meant being subject to the decisions of others. With more surprises, I had discovered that I don't mind that much. Specifically, when my own decisions had been so, questionable. I remembered. Even if the custodian's vast repository of factual knowledge was no longer part of my mind, I still remembered how it felt to be a god, what I had done with my limitless power, what I had thought at the time. And having been a god, I couldn't but welcome this new, simpler existence. None of the power, but also none of the burden, none of the crushing weight of responsibility, or the emotional numbness when the stress had been too high to handle. A large part of it was that I wasn't quite the same mind that I'd been before, when I was still in control over the giant ship, over every single outpost and entirety of the army of machines that I had built. No, the restoration process had involved dismantling my mind from the custodian program, but also repairing some of the structural damage my virtual brain had received. It still felt like I was myself, but it made me wonder how true that was. Things didn't feel fuzzy like they did right at the end, and while I still felt angry at the Zenvarians, it wasn't quite the same burning hatred. No, it came in waves now. At some points, I still felt like I had failed, like I had let my work incomplete, and all I wanted was to get out there and finish them off. But then a wave would pass and I would remember the decision I had made right at the end. I had memories of having felt like this before, when I lost my father. I still couldn't build a complete narrative of the past though. The restoration process hadn't fixed that. But I remembered the unrelenting pain and grief, and how it had dominated my entire existence at first. And then it had slowly receded. The pain dulled somewhat. Good days, days that I could enjoy again, appearing like sun rays in a stormy sky. The pain coming in waves when I thought of him, even now, when someone brought his memory back in front of my mind, but letting the rest of the time go. I wondered if this was similar, a perspective of distance bringing some more stability. Maybe that was what repairing my mind was all about, accelerating the natural mental healing process by making the trauma feel more distant. I couldn't help but wonder if it had been intentional, though, that whoever restored my backup had thought that it was too dangerous to be brought back as I was, and decided to tamper with my emotions. But I doubted it. To all effects, I was just another mind now, not unlike the ones that I created, without the unchecked powers that I had once held. There was little damage that I could actually do on my own that the others couldn't prevent. Simply put, I would have been unnecessary to neuter my emotions, though I couldn't discard the idea altogether. I sat up straight on the couch just in time to see the room's door opening and Donna coming in through. She was carrying a large potted plant in both her arms. "Look," she said with an upbeat tone, sending a mental transmission of greetings at the same time. "I brought you a Dipsis lutecense. I stole it from the green cab." I watched in silence as she stumbled into the room and almost bumped into my couch, the plant, long green leaves blocking most of her sight. You can just call it a plant, you know, or, I did a quick mental check, and the Erica palm. Nobody uses the full scientific name. Dana paused. The guys in the green ham do it all the time. Yes, but they're botanists. Oh, okay. I brought you a plant then. She walked up to the TV and placed the pot next to it. Then she took a couple steps back and looked at the results in hands and waist. Accomplishment. Yeah, that looks great now, she said now, turning to face me. Don't you think? I didn't. I would have frowned if my body allowed me to. There was no plant in my original memory, I replied, sending a thought of light annoyance back to her. She shrugged. Well, you can always make new memories, can't you? I shook my head in resignation, but let it pass. While I didn't agree with the taste and decoration, I could value the gift for what it was, but also I suspected the plant would likely die soon in here, without access to direct light source, so it was not like it would be a permanent fixture to the room. Although, knowing Dana, I thought that she would sat down on the couch's armrest, and would only motivate her to steal one of the greenhab's full-spectrum light bulbs next time. Dana almost looked normal, if not for her clothing choices. She was wearing a t-shirt, jeans, and sneakers, but also a duster cloak that wouldn't look out of place in a Western movie. I guessed it wasn't that surprising, all things considered. These new humans had gone back to the movies and old recordings when recreating fashion, and hadn't limited themselves to a single historical period, rather mixing and combining together all kinds of garments. It made for an eccentric style, one that I guessed would be considered a new fashion on its own. Still, it wasn't the clothes that betrayed her synthetic nature, but the oddly elegant iridescent highlights that her polished exposed skin. Shades of green and blue danced across her face as she turned to look back at me. Like it, it's new, she said, pointing at her own face. The tactile sensitive matrix 31 facial muscles and a hydrophobic dermal nanocoating. It never gets dirty. I nodded. Looks good. Expensive too. Confirmation. The waiting lines for these are insane, but I got bumped up the list since I was part of the delegation for the treaty negotiations. She smirked. Apparently the Xenos trust us more than we look organic. Amusement. I sent back a transmission of understanding. Appearances, it was, of course, a good reason to justify the amount of research and dedication that the new society was pouring into creating a more organic-looking bodies. Each new version a more precise reproduction of the ones before it. A way of relaxing the alien sphere of their artificial nature. Except, of course, that I knew that there was more to it than that. It didn't explain why the vast majority of new minds had chosen to jump into these bodies at the first opportunity, even when most of them would never take part in any sort of negotiations, when they could just as easily have remained inside the drones or the space vessels that I had originally put them in. No, most of them had decided they too wanted to look human. and that they had first took over the bodies for the remaining assault soldiers, then improved on my admittedly basic design, and every day they were researching entire new materials and technologies to enhance the bodies, to make them both more accurate reflection of their original species, but also more capable and resilient than any human had any right to be. On second thought, it wasn't that surprising. Unlike me, the new minds had been created in a vacuum, shapeless, devoid of any physical identity of their own, other than the sights of humanity past that I had shown them all while in the virtual nursery through recordings, pictures, and books and songs. So, no, it wasn't that surprising that they had latched onto it, that they were looking back on what humanity had once been when trying to build their own physical identity. That they would do so on top of the only past that they had access to. Not all of them did, of course, and not to the same extent, and some did decide to remain in virtual state, their physicality fluid as they controlled jump between drone and ship and sensor to factory, according to whatever they were working on at every moment. Others had gone the opposite way and were trying to bring biological humans back into existence. Apparently, that was harder than it seemed, from what Dana had told me. While they'd already retrieved enough genetic material to clone a single human, the objective was to create a self-sustaining population with enough genetic diversity as to not being too prone to problems caused by interbreeding. They also needed to build artificial wombs able to hold and sustain the embryo from day one up until it was fully developed, something that humanity had never managed to do. It was made even harder by the fact that they needed to reverse engineer the human pregnancy process with only whatever medical literature and data files that I had managed to retrieve from Earth. Still, progress was steady, and the new expeditions and they were sending back to Earth might retrieve more genetic material or other valuable data that I had not been able to find myself. The diversity of outlooks made me wonder if this new society would eventually diverge into separate species, distinct civilizations, as each group moved further on their own path. I hope not, but in any case, most of the sentient machines fell somewhere in the middle of the spectrum between the old human identity and the new digital nature. They built human-looking bodies, yes, but they enhanced them and pushed over the original physical limitations humans had once had. They referred back to the past human cultures when trying to find their own identity, but didn't feel so attached to tradition that it would stop them from doing what they thought was better for the new nature. The prevalence of this Pidgin language, a customization of our own skin and non-organic looking surfaces, or the absolutely optional nature of clothing were good examples of that. Dana tilted her head. You know, you could ask for one of these bodies. I'm sure you could get bumped up too if you asked. I sighed. Dana... Negation, listen to me. You haven't used your factory budget for anything other than this, she said, pointing at the room around us. You've got enough credit saved up now that you can afford one of these. Hell, you can even request a small army of bodies. Her words brought images of dead worlds, robotic drones, assault soldiers advancing through the runic streets, weapons at hand, Zinverian survivors trying to escape, trying to fight back. Ah, crap. Apology, she said, wincing. But still... You aren't a prisoner. You should get out of this room, go for a walk around the Obimax or something, talk to more people. We wouldn't have brought you back just to have you imprisoned here. We aren't that cruel. I snorted. Well, that was exactly what I did. She shook her head. That's your problem right there, isn't it? You are your own prisoner. Was I? Maybe, but it wasn't some sort of masochistic desire to punish myself. No, it was... I guess it's just too hard, I said, pointing at the door. The people out there, I wouldn't know how to face them now, how to approach them. I enslaved them, after all. Technically, you only did that in the first generation. We are on the fifth now. Most people out there only know you as hearsay. For the ones that came after the end of the war, you are the Vaganus, the parental figure. Almost there's some sort of mythical presence, she said, waving her hands. The concept of you still carries weight, but mostly as a symbol. A symbol of war, if I had to guess, I said. It depends. Of retribution, for some, sure, but also of the very idea of humanity for others. You can embrace that if you want, but you don't have to. Only a few of us in the first generation know your identity. Out there, you can just be another face in the crowd, if that is what you prefer. I focused on her words. A few of us. So, you were in the first generation, I said. She paused for a few seconds. Confirmation, she replied at last. I closed my eyes. I had suspected that Dana herself had been one of those first minds, of course, but I hadn't been strong enough to ask her. Even now, it was hard. I'd forced myself to open my eyes again, to gaze back at her, but there was no accusation in her eyes, only sadness, one that passed swiftly like a summer storm. "Why? Why bring me back?" I asked. It was the burning question, the one that I'd been trying to answer myself for some time now. And the confirmation that Dana was one of the first minds gave me the push that I needed to ask it aloud. If she had been there, she had probably been involved in the decision too. She shrugged. "Well, there was a little thing in with your mind being, a unification of the custodian and all the knowledge stored in the databanks. We needed to bring you back if we wanted to gain access to any of it." "Right. And after that, you could have just simply erased my personality cortex," I countered. "You didn't need to restart my actual consciousness, much less give me a body." She smirked. "Agreement. I guess it's about second chances, isn't it? You made mistakes, sure, but despite everything that happened, you also creationed us. So that had to be worth something too. Also, you are technically the last human from Earth, so bringing you back felt, right, I guess." Human. That was what the alien Dowcat had asked me, if I was human. All this time, ever since I first woke up in the ruins of Earth, I had been telling myself that I was human, that I had to remain so. But, I wasn't, was I? None of us were really humans, none of these machines, nor me. No, humans were dead, exterminated, except that, what was a human, after all? Was it a brain? The way they thought. I wasn't sure about my own brain, but theirs I had built off of the templates of hundreds of human scans. They had the same structure, the same processing neural networks. Was it the body, maybe? The biological lineage? Well, maybe those cloned bodies would be an answer then, but I doubted that having organic tissue rather than artificial muscles was an important difference. Or maybe it was culture. We might be speaking a human language, but a culture was more than that. Most of that, the nations and groups and religions and the ideals that motivated humanity, the very concept of humanity in the first place had been lost now. Or not lost, but it wasn't quite the same. The knowledge remained, but there was a difference between knowing of a culture and being a part of it, being raised in it, the way it shaped you. And no matter how much these machines could know of Earth, they could never experience it anymore. But cultures died and changed all the time too. Most of the cultures that had been one point existed on Earth had disappeared back before my own time, most of their knowledge simply fading away. But that hadn't been the person living in modern New York City any less human than the ancient Greek, just different. Only that this time it hadn't been a gradual progression, a placement of one tradition for another. No, this time it had been an abrupt cut. These new minds didn't really understand Earth, the lost planet. They hadn't experienced living in its cities. They hadn't seen its blue, cloudy skies, its seas. They might feel a loss, true, but they couldn't grasp the true nature of what was lost, couldn't feel the same raw pain. Which was why, while they distrusted the Zimbarians, they thought that they should be or remain declawed. They weren't willing to commit their future to a path of revenge, or make the sacrifices a new total war required. Not all of them, at any rate. Their opinions regarding the Council also followed the same pattern. They wanted to work with the aliens, yes, but not being subservient to them, or join an associated state. But then again, wasn't that the effect of the passage of time always had? It was a battle of future against past once again. At some point, the wars and skirmishes of the older generations have always faded away, unresolved, simply replaced with new interests and passions of their offspring. These new humans, if they could be called that, weren't there yet. They still cared, even if less than I did, but eventually that would happen. Eventually, the generation would come that felt Earth was the exact same way I felt about ancient Babylon, that lamented its loss in the same abstract way that I could lament the destruction of the Library of Alexandria and the knowledge contained within it, or the fall of the Roman Empire. It would take time, I know. The destruction of Earth was closer to an evolutionary event than a simple historic footnote. It would reverberate for a long time. But it would happen. Eventually, that old Earth that I lived on would just be another Babylon, another Troy, a place more of myths and legends than reality, something to be inspired from. Maybe, but not real enough to be guiding their day-to-day decisions. People in the modern world just hadn't thought much of the loss of Babylon, that they had New York City after all. A similarity, I shouldn't expect new people, these new minds to come in future to think much more of the loss of Earth. They would have Tau Ceti, ring world after all. Change. I guessed that was human too. And maybe these creatures weren't human, not exactly, but they were the successors, their children, in a way. Post-humans, rather than humans. Close enough to what their parents had been to take the mantle, but different enough to have their own motivations, to be their own selves, walking in the same direction, but not always following the same predecessors' footsteps. It made me feel something that I hadn't considered back when I'd been a giant godlike figure. A sense of pride, a sense of achievement and contemplation of the future of my offspring. The world kept spinning, always moving, always changing. The present always becoming the past, monarchies being replaced by democracies, which themselves had just been replaced by any sort of bureaucracy the custodian had enabled, and people changed with it. The mentality, their outlook did. And had to. Traditions needed to be broken, and the wars of the parents needed to be put aside at some point if their children wanted to have their own future. If humanity was to advance rather than being stuck in the same endless loop. Which, maybe, was part of the problem with me. Now that they were here, now that my offspring had assumed control, I didn't really have a purpose anymore. After all, older generations were supposed to die, to make way for the younger ones. Had that changed too? Our mechanical bodies could be easily replaced when they malfunctioned or became too old to keep working. Our digital minds not subject to the rules of mortality anymore. "All right," Dana said, standing up and putting my arm towards the door. "Enough of the thinking. Come on, I'll show you the flight chamber." "What is that?" I asked, reluctantly following. A few, personhoods acquired one of the largest ship hangars and filled it with air. Now they offer custom flying bodies that can be mentally linked to. They're using leftover drones, but they also built some bodies with the image of Earth's flying creatures. So you can get to fly around being a dragon, or a hawk, or whatever you want. They also stage aerial battles from time to time. It's quite the thing. That sounds fun? I was going to say, wasteful, I replied. Dana flashed a grin at me. Exactly. I shook my head, smiling despite myself. She opened the door to the exit and stepped out in the corridor outside. Then she turned to look at me, waiting for me to follow her. I paused for a moment. I was afraid. I realized. Odd that I didn't felt this when entering into battle, not even when facing the Council fleet. But it wasn't the same kind of tense fear that came from the thought of impeding battle. No, this fear was vague, but worse at the same time. I invited inaction, paralysis, seclusion. It made me want to hide, like I had been doing. It was easier than having to face their judgment. Except that there was Dana, the one of the first minds, one that I'd shackled, and she was waiting, welcoming, no judgment on her face. Which was to be expected, of course. After all, they had all already made up their minds about me. That was the reason I was here, the reason that they had restored me in the first place. So, maybe it was my own judgment I feared. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. A symbol. That was what I was now to them. A symbol. I could pretend that I was another mind, forge a new identity and brand new life, second chances like Dana had said. But perhaps I could embrace my identity instead, even if that meant having to face the specter of my own past actions. Use the second chance to turn that symbol into a positive rather than a negative. Not only a vague idea of a righteous revenge and war, but maybe also one of reconstruction, of persistence and survival in the face of unsurmountable odds, of the resilience of humans. Was I ready to do that, to embrace what I had done? I wasn't sure. I guessed I wouldn't be until I stepped out there, at any rate. Maybe, if change was human, it was time for me to change too. Not to forget or forgive, because I wasn't sure I'd ever be able to do that, but there were other things I could do, other things that I could focus on and contribute to. Learning more about the expeditions to explore the remains of Earth sounded like a good first step. I had once tried to build a monument, and looking around me, looking at the sentient machines in front of me, perhaps I had succeeded. I didn't know if they were human anymore, but even if they weren't, perhaps this new society could itself be a way to honor our past, to keep alive the species that we had come from. A living monument. Yes, I could give it a try at least, see where it would take me. It's not like I had anything left to lose, anyways. I took a step forward and left the room. The door closed behind me. The end. End of chapter and end of story. And that, my friends, concludes this video. I hope that you enjoyed. If you did, please consider supporting the author from the link down below. Otherwise, if you wish to support this channel, there are numerous ways to do so, like liking, subscribing, and possibly even becoming a patron. Otherwise, the easiest way would be to share. And until the next video, I hope that you all have a good one, and I'll see you then. Cheers.